A few words while we're getting ourselves organised. Just really want to acknowledge how fantastic it is to be here in front of a national live export industry conference. You know, 11 years ago, one could only have imagined in our wildest dreams that we would have survived and live to breathe another day, and not only that, thrive and prosper and go on to bigger and better things. So it's just want to acknowledge to you all how wonderful it is to be here. But of course, none of us are going to take it for granted. And today is really a discussion about what we've learned from that time and how we're applying it and what we're thinking about the future. So we've got 45 minutes and we're actually running a little early. So if there are any questions from the audience, hopefully we'll have some time to take those at the end. So 45 minutes. And really, I'm delighted to say I think I have got the talent and the dream panel of the conference. So I'm really delighted to be joined by Dr. Peter Barnard, Donal Sullivan and Greg Pankhurst. We're going to start by setting the scene and have a little reflection time, and then we're going to end with trying to leave you with some key messages and some learnings. So I'd like to take you all back to 2011. If you can think back to where you were, I think about it like the day the bomb dropped. So industry, from our perspective, we'd been made aware that a major shock was coming, but we really weren't aware to what extent. Thousands of Australians tuned into the Four Corners episode and really were outraged by what was portrayed. At the time, I was on the board of the NTCA, and I'll never forget it, sitting in the lounge room at home, and immediately following the airing of that episode, we went into full crisis mode. We conveyed a board meeting over the phone, and there were many hundreds to follow that in rapid succession. So for me, it was like the day the bomb went off. I'd like to start with the panel now and get your reflections on where you were in 2011. So I was going to start with you, Dr. Peter Barnard. So in my notes, I've written here that I describe you as an academic of industry. That's how I think about you. An agricultural economist of some 30 years' experience. At the time of the ban, you were working for Meat and Livestock Australia, which is fair to say was a focus of a lot of criticism by the media at the time, particularly around the Mark I boxes. There also appeared to be some confusion within industry and the broader community about the purpose of MLA and what role they played in industry. So Peter, take us back to 2011 from your perspective and from your colleagues' perspective, and what the days were like within MLA at that time.
Well, as Don Heatley just described, they were dark days in many ways. As you said, Tracey, I was a general manager at Meat and Livestock Australia. I had a number of responsibilities, but one of those responsibilities was live exports. And of course, immediately following airing of the Four Corners program, there was a maelstrom of media interest and publicity. I think, in fact, that it was the biggest story in a decade in Australia. But I consider myself very fortunate because Don Heatley took the brunt of that publicity. I don't know how many interviews Don did over those days. I didn't do one interview. But rather, my efforts were determined to be best directed at defining the conditions of a trade that would reopen under conditions acceptable to the community and acceptable to government. Look, during the early days, the Four Corners program aired on 30th of May. During that first week, we had a number of meetings with government. I penned a number of letters to government on conditions that MLA thought would be acceptable both for the government and for the community for the trade to continue. And at the core of those conditions was that we would ensure that OIE standards of animal welfare, those are the internationally agreed standards of animal welfare, would apply throughout the trade to Indonesia. Those letters, those representations, of course, were rejected by government, but government did take that core proposal that was contained in the MLA letters after discussion with industry, of course, and that was embodied in SCAS. Four Corners aired on the 30th of May. The trade was shut down on the 8th of June. And then there was a frantic month meeting with government, defining those new conditions under which the trade would open. So it was agreed at the beginning that OIE standards would apply, but it was about precisely how those standards would apply. The SCAS checklist, as it's known now, and how the verification would occur. So it was an extraordinary 4 weeks, but on the 6th of July, those SCAS conditions were law. So, you know, I must say, Tracey, I can't remember a time in my life that I've worked harder than those 4 weeks. And I used to turn up at work at 4:30, but somebody under me, Michael Finucane, was often in the office before I arrived. It was just an extraordinary time, but we knew how important it was to define those new conditions and to get the trade reopening, because we knew the damage that it was causing not only to the live industry, not only to the producers in Northern Australia, but to Australia generally, and that damage is still felt.
Thanks, Peter. We're going to have a question a little more on SCAS in a moment, but yeah, I appreciate those perspectives. I was going to go to Greg next. So Greg Pankhurst, certainly a doyen of industry, many decades owning and operating multiple feedlots and operations in Indonesia with valued Indonesian business partners. Also working in advocacy roles as a champion of industry. Can you give us a feel from your perspective how things played out for you in 2011? I'm interested on the impact on you personally, your family, and the working environment around you, Greg, but also professionally.
Thanks, Tracey. And look, Peter's walked us through up until the 7th of July, and just to follow on from that, Austrex and Elders both had a boat arrive on the 17th of August. So from the 7th of July to the 17th of August is what the timing was to get SCAS underway in Indonesia. So just to step back, so I'd been in Indonesia already 20 years when 2011 happened. So I was well established there. I was quite culturally aligned. I was traditionally aligned. I still spoke, I spoke good Indonesian. I had at that time two very good business partners, Diki Adiwaso, who's here today, and CPC. And so we had another 25 feedlot colleagues in Indonesia. And so it's very important to think about the whole business, not just our own individual business, but the whole industry. So there was 25 players up there at the time, importing up to 1 million cattle at a time. So when you think about it, 1 million cattle at the time, that was supplying about 100, I just did the figures quickly, that was supplying 100 million people's meat for the year. So if we want to cut off 100 million cattle, therefore almost a little bit under half of the total meat consumption for Indonesia was going to be stopped overnight. So the whole industry, so there are 25 colleagues of industry players up there at the time, would have employed about 20,000 people. And then there was a carry on to that for maybe another, maybe 300,000 people the feedlot industry directly supported. So I can remember on the 8th of June when Julia Gillard came out and said, now we're going to suspend all trade of cattle to Indonesia. And so I called, and Dickie and I called staff, and I was back in Indonesia at this time. I had come home on the 30th of May to be with my family when the program aired, and then I went straight back to Indonesia. And I can remember some of my long-term employees who'd been with me for 20 years, and they still continue to with Troy and Dickie in Indonesia. These guys cried, and they said, "This is it. It's finished. What are we going to do? The business is finished. We're not going to be able to sell those cattle. We're not going to be able to buy that feed. We're not going to be able to feed our families." So, and every single feedlot across Indonesia, that was happening. The owners were going to their staff, were going to their customer. You know, the reaction to customers was huge. You know, we were selling 150 cattle a day, and essentially we stopped overnight selling any cattle because we'd already started stunning. So we were fully stunning when the ban came in, but we had to go to our customers and say, okay, it's very uncertain. We don't know what's going to happen. So we essentially had to stop. So industry in Indonesia, as is industry here, it was shocking. It was terrible, and what we saw, we can never agree with. It was shocking what we did see, but really at the end of the day, industry was working both sides to improve animal welfare, which we were doing.
Thanks, Greg. I'd like to now move to Donal Sullivan. You bring a very unique and special insight into today's panel, I think. So you're the eldest of 5 kids. You grew up on a cattle property outside of Mataranka, heavily reliant on the live export industry for your family's livelihood. I think at the time you were a young girl away at boarding school, if I remember rightly, and isolated from your family. I'd just like to acknowledge your dad, Rowan Sullivan. He featured in the Four Corners program and at the time was the president of the NTCA, and I can tell you that man gave thousands of hours of his time voluntarily to this industry to try and help get it back on its feet. So really defending industry, supporting the CEO, Luke Bowen, at the time of the NTCA, and really leading through a time of crisis. Mum, Sally Sullivan, was holding the fort and defending the front line from home. So can you describe as best you can in a few minutes what the impact was like for you and your family from your perspective?
Thanks, Tracey. Yeah, so when the program aired, we'd sat under a tree and watched Dad interviewed by Sarah Ferguson, sort of weeks previous to that, and we'd been told that they had something bad, but we didn't know what that was, and we didn't know how bad it was going to be. And Sarah even said to my father, she said, "This is your chance to say your piece." But turns out it wasn't really. It was pretty much already decided what angle the program was going to take, and it was just sort of a token gesture, I guess, that we were in it. Yeah, so when it aired, I was at boarding school with my sisters, about 1,000 k's from home. In Alice Springs we were, and I guess the school I was going to, not a huge rural focus, not a lot of people really understood what we were doing or why we were doing it, so fielded quite a few curly questions from my classmates, and being a young person myself, not really understanding further down the supply chain and those sort of things, it was quite hard to be confronted with that by your peers, and also a huge sense of helplessness in that the live export industry underpinned my entire life, but I had absolutely no control over what was happening, and a huge amount of uncertainty there for our family. A lot of time with Dad away, and a lot of I guess just trying to keep the business rolling, because at the end of the day, you need a roof over your head, and the school fees had to be paid. So, yeah, getting in extra staff at a huge cost to the business that didn't have a huge margin to start off with, you know, it was a really chaotic and uncertain time for our family, and I think that uncertainty and lack of control was mirrored in a lot of producers, in that this was something that was pretty well entirely out of their hands, but affected them, you know, completely. Yeah.
Thanks, Donal, and I really appreciate everyone sharing their perspectives. We like to look forward and not hark on the past, but I think it is important from time to time that we remind ourselves of those stories and just how profound our community was impacted. So I'd just like to change tack now and focus on the job at hand and really thinking about some of the things that we've learned along the way. Peter, as you mentioned, there was a lot of work happening already prior to the ban, and behind the scenes, you know, feverishly developing standards and a focus really on continual improvement of the industry. So I know a couple of you here were at the coal face of being part of that process. Clearly the ban certainly expedited that. I think one of the things that came out of the live export class action was that there were OOE compliant supply chains into Indonesia, and so we know that the work was being done and there were appropriate operations going on. I guess my question is, we now have a world-class system in SCAS. We're exporting animal welfare best practice to the world. There's no question about that. So, you know, is our job done, or is there more work to do in developing a sustainable live export industry? Over to you, Peter.
Look, you think that your job is done at your own peril. A job is never done. A job in our own businesses is never done. A job across the industry is never completely done. There's always issues to address. There's always holes to plug. There's always areas for improvement. I mean, this industry is, from time to time, had major shocks. And I think in the future we've got to work assiduously to try to avoid those shocks. I mean, in the time that I've been involved in the industry at MLA, took over live exports about 12 months before the Indonesian issue arose. But during my time at MLA, I mean, there's been ships that have failed to dock in the that were going to the Middle East that had to be addressed, and alternate markets faced, and there were problems there. There were the Indonesian problems, and then there were problems with sheep conditions, ship conditions applying to sheep being transported to the Middle East. So those are major problems that really resonate with the public. We've got to be more transparent about what we're doing. We've got to be more open, and we've just got to try to address any issues whatsoever that exist in the trade, because there are people that want to stop the trade and will go to any length to try to stop the trade.
Greg, from your perspective, we're certainly hearing we can't rest on our laurels, and I think we've learnt that. What do you see as next for us in a sustainable live export industry?
Yes, so just to step back a bit, I think we just need to look what happened in Indonesia. Is that it took essentially from the 8th of July to the 17th of August, there's 6 weeks, but we had to be underway within 4 weeks. So it took 4 weeks to get SCAS established in Indonesia, and that was a relationship, really power of persuasion, and working with our Indonesian colleagues, and Dickie and I talked about it last night about how, you know, he had to go into a room of importers and say, we've got to change the way we do business, and if we don't change the do business, it's probably not going to continue. So it was really the power of persuasion, and it was really based on relationships back then, because I believe, and we'll touch on that later, that we really had good relationships back then. But as far as SCAS goes, you know, it took 4 weeks to start SCAS in Indonesia. So, and it has been an amazing journey in the last 11 years. So SCAS has seen, I don't know, it's probably close to 5 million cattle processed through Indonesia alone. So it's a huge number of cattle, and for the number of incidents which have incurred out of that 5 million cattle, it would be extremely, extremely small. So we've got to keep pushing hard. As Peter says, there are people trying to dig at us to try and change or stop the trade, which we'll talk about again later. But what happened in those initial times was quick, and it was based on relationships.
So just on that, B2B, so business relationships were very solid, particularly at a grassroots level. How about at a G2G, so a government-to-government level? There was very limited, if any, consultation with the Indonesian government prior to the ban, as I understand it. You know, Australia was, we were the sole provider of quality and safe protein into what could be described as a vulnerable market and consumer. So, you know, these markets are built on trust and built on relationships. We know that there was some significant damage at a government-to-government level as a result of the ban. How do you see the situation now from your perspective? We've obviously come a long way. Are we doing enough?
So on B2B, look, I don't think that's ever faltered. There's been exporters and importers have maintained their relationships even over COVID. We've seen great relationships maintained there. The trade has continued. A lot of in-country staff from exporters now. So look, there's a great transfer of knowledge there, and the B2B is great. I really worry about the G2G, and so we did see a reaction. It wasn't actually publicised as a reaction by the Indonesian government, but they imposed some quotas, they imposed some restrictions on the trade directly after the ban, and so we were seeing 500,000, 600,000 head of cattle coming in, and so they actually cut it back to, I think it was 230,000 head of cattle. So there's a massive drop, which was imposed by the Indonesian government, whether or not it was because of the ban, whether or not there was other thoughts. But again, you would have to think, you know, there was no interaction with the Indonesian government at all. The other factor that I always look at as well is the association. So you've got an association in Indonesia, used to be called APindo and now called Gapasindo. So it's supported by all the main feedlots and has a wide reach and covers all areas and looks at everything within the supply chain, from working with farmers has been involved in the vaccine rollout. So is integral and very, very important in the whole way things work up there. But I really think and it is a tradition and culture aspect. We have floundered in our relationship with the associations up there. And I really do think we need to put more time and effort into those relationship buildings with the associations, essentially, yeah. But and government, we need to start all over again with the government.
Right, so interesting perspective again, which possibly links into the building. There are ties with the associations up there. Donal, you were part of the Future NTCA program. Your family hosted on many occasions young Indonesian men and women studying agricultural science, part of the NTCA's Indonesian Pastoral Exchange program. I'm aware that since COVID, the program hasn't cranked back up again. How do you see programs like that playing a role in strengthening and developing those relationships? And do you think they're important for us to consider those as a part of the landscape going forward?
Yeah, absolutely. I think these relationships from the producer directly with the consumer and people working on the ground in Indonesia are paramount to maintaining a really great integrity throughout the entire supply chain, because as producers, our consumers come from a completely different culture. They speak different languages. They're in another country. You know, we're not a simple supply chain in that other Australian meat and livestock producers only have to communicate with Australian people. You know, we have huge barriers there that we need to overcome, and I think those sort of programs that allow direct interaction between producers and consumers and the future leaders in Indonesia are absolutely paramount to maintaining this industry. Yeah.
And Peter, any observations from you on the importance of relationships? You've obviously been involved B to G, I would say, and observations more broadly on how we've gone as an industry and what you see as areas we should be focused on going forward?
Look, I think relationships at every level are important. They're important business to business that Greg is particularly involved with. They're important at a association to association level, and they're critically important on a government to government level. And, you know, Tracey, I just hope that we've learnt the lessons from the Indonesian 2011 episode. And surely one of those lessons is that never again should Australia precipitously and arbitrarily shut down a food trade. I mean, I think it's hard to imagine from an Australian point of view what it is to be reliant on food imports, either food imports as a whole or food imports in important categories. You know, to be reliant on another nation supplying your food needs to keep your population sustained and alive. I mean, it's just hard for us to imagine because we have food in abundance. And for us to act in a way that shuts down such a trade, I mean, I think we have a responsibility to continue such trades. It's reputationally damaging for Australia, and it's just bad regulation. It's regulation designed to harm producers in Australia, harm our customers overseas. And I just hope that the Australian government has learnt from those issues in 2001 and will never again act in the same way. And that applies to the sheep trade to the Middle East, another trade of current interest. Set the standards for the trade by all means. I mean, that's fair, that's appropriate regulation to set the standards, but don't shut the trade down.
Yeah, you paint a very, I think, a very graphic picture, and I think Australians can only imagine what it would be like to have our food supply switched off. You know, in some small part, some communities experience it with floods and, you know, COVID and whatnot, and going into supermarket, and you saw the impact of no toilet paper on the shelves, you know, on Australian communities. Imagine what it'd be like if it was your primary and only source of healthy protein. So it's very important reflections there. I'd like to now turn to social media and the importance or otherwise of that as a tool. I think channeling our keynote speaker this morning, I'm going to use a few sort of battleground analogies, if you like, but it's fair to say that following the airing of Four Corners, there was an enormous outpouring of outrage, particularly it played out on social media, and it definitely had influence over government. Many of us were barely heard of Twitter Some were even still on the old dial-up internet connectivity via the fax line, and Wi-Fi was certainly not ubiquitous. It wasn't in houses, and so we really were flat-footed when it come to our ability to take it up to the debate in the social media space. So, yep, if the battleground, it was apparent social media was a weapon on the front line. 11 years on, I guess, how's our arsenal looking? Are we better equipped? And I just want to run through some quick stats, if you allow me. So, Animals Australia, for example, has 1.6 million followers on Facebook, where MLA sits at 40,000, NFF 18,000, and NTCA 14,000. And our national cattle body sits at 12,000. Instagram, on the other hand, PETA has 1.4 million followers. Cattle Council and MLA sit at around 3,000 odd, NFF 1,800 and NTCA 1,300. I could go on. There's Twitter, TikTok, Snapchat, and any number of other social media platforms popping up from time to time. So how are we looking? If social media is a weapon in our arsenal, how are we looking? Donal Sullivan, you have 5,500 followers on Instagram and could be considered a social media influencer. Given that you have more followers than our national bodies on that platform, is social media an echo chamber, or is it an effective tool to communicate about our industry? And if so, are we doing enough?
Thanks. So social media is it's a great weapon, but it can be used both ways. It doesn't discriminate. They are platforms which constantly change, the algorithms change, and they are designed to show you what you want to see that's going to keep you on the platform longer. So they do turn into individual echo chambers for each user, and so getting out of people's chamber and engaging with the people who you want to engage with is a big challenge, and it does need strategy, and it does need consideration. It's not just something that you can go at, as a representing body, yeah, we're going to start an Instagram account and we're just going to put up a few photos and that sort of thing. You're not going to achieve what you want to achieve by doing that. And I think there's definitely room for discussion about what is the role of our peak bodies on social media, and that direction needs to come from stakeholders. What do we expect from our peak bodies on social media? Whose job is it to talk to our consumers? Whose job is it to talk to the Australian public? Is it the producer's job? Is it our representing body's job? Who's doing it? Because if we don't organise for that to be someone's role, someone will tell that story for us. And I can guarantee if you search on Instagram live export, if your algorithm doesn't already involve agriculture, it's going to bring up animal welfare and animal rights issues. So who's there putting our story out there? I think social media it requires collaboration and it requires consideration, and it's not just a shoot from the hip, put a cute photo up every now and again. It's a very powerful vehicle when it's used properly, and there's definitely a lot of room there for us to have a discussion and to grow in that area.
So we've seen there's an amazing group featuring here this couple of days, the Wyland, the Young Livestock Exporters Network. They're certainly out advocating and presenting a really positive future face of the industry. So that's been an effective tool so far. I'm wondering about the industry bodies and the leadership of our industry. Do we understand social media like young folk do? Is there a role for, and I think what you're saying, the approach needs to be unified and it needs to be agreed to. Do you think as an industry we understand algorithms, we understand the technology? Is there enough training going on throughout the community as to what to watch out for or what to do in this space, or could we be doing more?
Oh, I think absolutely we can be doing more. We can always be doing more. And the fact that these platforms change and how they're used, the way in which they're used changes, is lesson enough in itself that we constantly need to be looking at how we're using them and teaching people how to use them in the best way possible. Facebook in 2011 is very different to Facebook now, and the same goes with Instagram and, you know, I don't know if you want to go down the rabbit hole of TikTok and Snapchat and those sort of things, but, you know, there is definitely more being put out there for producers in terms of telling, you know, the production story, but as a supply chain and as a live export industry, you know, I think there's definitely some work that needs to be done there because, yeah, there's some big gaps there, I think, and there's, like I said, if we don't tell that story, someone else is going to tell it for us.
Greg, young Indonesian folk are very well connected socially. You must see that in the businesses you operate in over there. From your perspective, is social media a useful tool for communicating with each other, but also with our consumer and the supply chains? And do you see us doing enough in that space?
Oh, I think right across the media spectrum. So Peter touched on it. The Four Corners story was the most highly publicised story in Australia for a 10-year period. It even eclipsed 9/11. So it was right out there. It was just crazy, and that was using radio and TV. So we should and print. So you know, the majority of the people in this room, I'm sure, 50% have only got Instagram, 50% have only got Facebook. So we've still got to continue to talk, but the majority, well, all the people in this room are probably don't need to be preached to. So we've got those other people outside the room that we're not really thinking about. So we really need to start thinking about the people outside the room and talking to them through whatever media is possible. But to go on to Indonesia, 270, 280 million people in Indonesia. The majority of the people under 25 have got Instagram, Facebook, TikTok. They've got all the social media. So there's about 150, 170 million people who engage in some form of social media every day. They all want to eat beef. They only eat 2.1 kilograms of beef per person per year. 2.1 kilograms of beef per person per year. We eat about 25. Brazilians eat about 60. 750,000 head of cattle would be needed to give them an extra 500 grams. So if that steak that you had last night, that 400-gram steak that you had last night, if we wanted to supply another one of those to Indonesia, one person per year would need 750,000 head of cattle. So we need to explain those numbers right across the board, including in Indonesia, because they are desperate to eat more and more high-quality products. And so I think the way to push it out to both sides of the ditch, so over here, what an amazing industry it is and what we are doing so well to make sure the supply chains are strong, but we also need to explain to the Indonesians that it can be cut off so quickly, and that really will, and as Peter said, that will really drastically affect their food supply and food availability.
So, Peter, the attention economy is very congested. It's a full space. Most people's every waking moment's consumed now, so it's very difficult to get the messages through. Have you got any insights from your perspective of how we're going as an industry and how we can present ourselves?
Look, definitely we're going better than we have in the past. Community sentiment to the industry has recovered, fairly significantly from the 2011 episodes. but it's important to continue to do more. And I think the social media is an absolutely important space. But my belief is that it works best when it comes from the coalface. So it doesn't work as well when it comes from industry associations. It's got to be actors at the coalface this end and the coalface in Indonesia, because social media relies on an emotive connection as well as sort of a general statistical connection. It really, you've got to, it appeals to the emotions as much as to the intellect. And so you've got to introduce that emotional connection, and that's best done by actors at the coalface. And I think industry associations can facilitate increased presence on social media, but we all have a responsibility. As Troy said earlier today, we all have a responsibility in this area to increase our presence.
Yeah, well, we certainly understand how powerful an emotional connection can be. So if social media is a weapon in our arsenal and a tool to build our defences, I'd like to talk now about strategy and the long game. So in 2011, we saw military precision planned and executed strategy with the animal welfare, with the activists, Animals Australia, Get Up, RSPCA, and some would even say our national broadcaster played a role, certainly all working together with a laser-like focus on its target. They were sharp and they executed their strategy perfectly. Many didn't see it coming. The next battle we do know is coming, however, is the impending shutdown of the live sheep trade. Governments are working hard to convince the beef industry that their focus is not on cattle, it's only on sheep. Do we know the criteria and the evidentiary base for this decision? Is it based on ideology? Is it internal pressure coming from caucus and inner suburban seats? Is it political? And so is it only a matter of time before they come gunning for the beef trade? So we know this one's coming. Have we learnt from 2011? Do we have a strategy as an industry, and what is our long game? It may be a difficult one to answer, but channeling Major General Stephen Day now, do we know what we're trying to achieve, and have we identified our objective? It's a bit of a curly one, but I'll start with you, Peter.
I think, well, the first thing I'll say is none of us can control governments. I mean, governments will, to a certain extent, act to forces of which we only represent one element. So that's got to be recognised from the start. The sheep industry, as Troy said in his opening remarks this morning, has made major improvements over the last 3 or 4 years. You compare the animal welfare record of the live export sheep industry against any other segment of animal agriculture in Australia, it stands up pretty well on comparative measures like mortalities, things that are commonly measured across all sectors of the industry. The live export sheep industry does remarkably well. I believe that story hasn't been fully told, it hasn't been fully communicated, and it needs to be rapidly communicated over the next 12 to 18 months while there's still time. As I said, Tracey, I mean, I just find it remarkable that we are contemplating a shutdown of the trade again. It is bad, bad regulation and needs to be wiped off the Australian agenda.
The importance of communication again. Donal, do you have any comments you wish to add, or around strategy about the long game, about how you see industry tackling these? This won't be the only issue. It's just highlighting that as an example, and it's one that we know is coming at us. But there are many out there that we aren't aware of. How we can, as an industry, prepare and be better, I guess, armed.
Yeah, I guess so. I guess getting out of our own echo chamber and communicating to the broader public who have a say in our social licence, I think is a big takeaway from 2011. There's no point just preaching to ourselves. We do need to be talking to the people who don't understand our industry. And I think people don't buy what you do, they buy why you do it. I stole that quote. But that our why is a huge part of this, and it's something that's not really spoken about in the public sphere. But we've heard some great stuff from Peter and from Greg about our why it's important to our consumers. And yeah, I think the rest of Australia and our government need to know that. We really, and I'm sure there is a lot of work being done, a lot of calm ducks on the surface with the legs paddling madly underneath. But yeah, it's just paramount, I think, our why. We need to put our why out there.
Greg, do you have, Donal makes a good point, understanding our why. Are we communicating that effectively, and is there a way that you see we could be influencing this debate better?
So I think our associations, LifeCorp and ALEC, are working very hard to put the right message out, and the exporters are doing the right thing to make sure that the message is portrayed throughout the supply chain. I think we really got to call on producers more and more, so sheep and cattle producers, if they want to have the live export as an option in their supply chain, and it is imperative in the supply chain. Without live export, you do not have too many options. Okay, at the moment, there's plenty of grass in the south. They'll come up and buy your cattle, but as soon as the grass dries out in the south, there's only one option, that's to go north. So we really need to get more interaction with our producers, who at the end of the day, and it's great, it's amazing to see the prices that are being received by producers at the moment. This is great, because we all know things change, and in 2 years' time it'll be different, in 5 years' time it'll be different again. So I'm very, very keen, and I think we really need to look at engaging more with producers.
Yeah, we certainly understand that we're all in this together. There's no doubt about that. We've got a couple of minutes left. I'm going to close off and give the panel opportunity to just share our key take-home message. But before I do that, probably got time for one quick question, if there's any from the floor. Justin Dyer.
Justin Dyer, Hayfield Station. Yes, looking back, what we've learned from 2011, I remember that time pretty well. And I can remember feeling at the time how disappointed as a producer I was in our national representative body, Cattle Council Australia. Even before, during and after. So I guess I'd just like a comment perhaps from the panel on what they feel the role of a well-funded, democratically elected, well-represented national body representing cattle producers in Australia has to play going forward, not only in the live export space, but all the other spaces that are out there, whether there are Indigenous issues with Indigenous bodies having more influence on how we operate our businesses, the carbon market, the methane issue, it can go on. And how we'll be able to communicate and cooperate up and down the supply chain. And perhaps Peter's got a comment about MLA's role in that process as well. Thank you.
Yeah, so it's a big question, and so in 30 seconds, I think the importance of a unified, well-funded national representative body is critical for an industry the size of ours. Peter, do you have any comments?
Well, you know, I think one of the themes that have been emphasised in this session is the importance of communicating both with the community and with government. And clearly, a body like the Cattle Council has a critical role in both those areas. I think particularly in representations to government, putting a case to government why the trade is needed, why it's so important to cattle producers and to sheep producers, and also generally the conditions that should apply to the trade, the reasonable conditions that should apply to the trade. So, you know, I think the Cattle Council, in its past form and its new form, plays, you know, a pivotal role in this industry, the live export industry, as well as the producing industry.
Yeah, there's no question it's critical that we get it right, and if we don't, there's just so much at stake. Okay, just a couple of comments from each of you as we wrap it up now. We've probably got no more than 60 seconds each, so I'll start with you, Peter, your key takeaway from for the audience today.
Well, like, you know, I think in terms of lessons learned, I've said on a number of occasions through the last 45 minutes, I just hope the big lesson learnt is to realise the reliance some overseas countries have on our food supplies and not to shut down food trade. Believe me, the ramifications from 2011 are still felt every time you go to Indonesia. They haven't forgotten what happened in 2011. It takes a long time for a customer country to recover from the sort of actions that occurred then. And so I hope that lesson is applied when conditions that pertain to the sheep trade are being considered. I guess, look, the other more positive lesson from 2011 that will always stick in my mind is just how responsive this trade is. I mean, here it was faced with a radical overhaul of conditions that apply to the trade. And within a month, the trade was back up and running. And by 2013, the trade to Indonesia was larger than ever, involving more supply chains and more facilities than ever. And that's just a marvellously responsive trade. And Don said this morning that this trade goes through peaks and troughs, and it's going through a difficult time at the moment, but it will recover because it is, like the rest of agriculture, responsive.
So nice to finish on a positive note, and certainly as a country that exports 70% of what we produce, trust is critical, and trusting Australia as a trading partner is at the top of the tree for all of us here. Donal, with some closing comments from you.
Yep. So in terms of lessons learnt over the last 10 years, I think again, going back to our why are we doing this? And it's for the animals, isn't it? You know, we want the absolute best outcome for these animals, and I think that story needs to be shouted from the rooftops in terms of progress that's been made. It's world class, and yeah, we've had some fantastic outcomes. Yeah.
So it's about animal welfare and our learnings from that.
It comes back to the animals every day, doesn't it? It's why we're all here. Yep, it's paramount, I think. Yeah.
I think we understand as growing levels of affluence improve around the world that expectations around animal welfare pretty well grow in line with levels of affluence. So Donal is absolutely right. There's the continued focus and importance of that for us going forward is paramount. A few comments from you, Greg?
Yeah, it's certainly all about animal welfare, and we've seen animal welfare continue to improve across the supply chain. And in Australia, look, it is certainly improving, but we need to keep our head and our mind focused. It needs to be sustainable. So we need to be working with government, we need to be working with producers to keep on track. We cannot have overrunning costs. We need, this is a long-term business. There's been a lot of money invested both sides. There's a lot of people employed. We talk more about the people we feed in these nations that we supply. We really need, if it's going to be sustainable, we need to think about the costs that have been incurred on both sides. So to run things like SCAS, it's a great thing, but it costs a lot of money in Indonesia for the importers to do that. And on the exporter side, it costs a lot of money to do what they're doing government side as well. So we really need to keep that sustainability and that ability to continue to operate, but never forgetting the animal welfare and traceability.
Yeah, so some realistic expectations of what's required of producers in the supply chain. There's only so much, I guess. A dollar can only stretch so far. So some really important messages there. Don't take anything for granted. Continue to work hard and focus on, I guess, the margins for industry so it can keep doing and improving its practices in a world-class manner. I'd like to thank very much, so on behalf of the audience, Dr. Peter Barnard, Donal Sullivan and Greg Pankhurst, thanks very much for a very informative panel session this morning.
Thanks, Tracey.